adjustments, and just wanted to share that with the committee. So you're tracking what the next 5 years looks like in terms of project work. So in terms of the reforestation study that is currently happening, there's really no changes there that we've made. We're ODF staff are out collecting data, doing a really great job of collecting data in some pretty tough terrain and tough weather conditions. So kudos to my staff for doing that. That should be wrapping up this April, maybe into May. And the other piece, Mount Hood Environmental, once we collect the data, we'll be contracting them to analyze the data and for reporting as well. So the other piece that we're starting to look at is a web story map, which we've talked a little bit about, but really the focus is to get an initial contract started and set up so that we've got a web page that we can share, overview of the program, information about studies, about the team. And once we have results, we can post some high-level summary results for our studies. So the other piece what's changed is we're looking at developing a pilot study, and this would occur in 2025. And so this year we're focusing on developing that pilot study, mainly working with Mount Hood Environmental, or MHE, on both the field protocol and a study design. And that would include for riparian roads and steep slope rule sets. We thought it'd be best for Mount Hood Environmental to develop the field protocol, since it's so intertwined with the study design. And so that'll be a big focus this year. So then looking to next year, that would be we're looking to contract out field work to collect data for the pilot studies. And again, that's focused on riparian roads and steep slopes rule sets. So that pilot study, the purpose would be to focus on methods, and another sort of goal of that would be to inform the sample size for the long-term study when the full thorough study. And so it's not, I don't see it necessarily as a study that would result in publishable results. It's really to, like I said, focusing on the methodology, helping get kind of our ducks in a row. And then after that, that pilot study would be used to inform the next 3 years. Before I had mentioned we're considering starting with the riparian study, but I think this pilot study will really help to develop that longer term plan in terms of which rules to focus on. We're having discussions with Mount Hood Environmental on, do we keep these as separate studies? Do we group them together? There's different ways to handle that. And so I think the pilot study would really help them form that approach. So that's the update. I guess I'll open it up for any questions, concerns, or feedback on this long-term outlook.
Adam, this is Casey. This makes sense. I can see that you're like, hey, we heard from people that we might want to make sure we get it right. And with the riparian rules now coming into effect, maybe people are still learning how to get it right. So I recognize that we all need to figure out how to get it right kind of together. I appreciate your like reliance upon Mount Hood Environmental. I know that y'all are going to get better and better at this and develop your own expertise, but I think it's really valuable to have them come in since they've been working with us for so long now. So it makes sense. I do want to make sure that we get some solid dates on the calendar, even if it's 3 years ahead for when we're going to be monitoring the different parts of it. But thank you.
Yep.
And thanks for like recognizing and listening.
Yep. Yeah. Thanks, Casey. Any other questions, feedback?
I would just say this makes sense, Adam. Thanks.
Yep. Sure.
And following up on Seth's comment, sorry, I was also looking at the I guess draft of chapter 6 for the PFA HCP. And obviously y'all will probably need to communicate with Jennifer Weichel about changing some of the language in that draft chapter.
Yeah. Yeah. Jennifer and I communicate regularly, and so I'm keeping her up to date on all of this and this specifically this recent change. So yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
it doesn't look like a dramatic shift, but it would be good to just get it clarified out there, like the plan.
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah, I agree. Yep. But no miscommunication here. Yep.
And Jennifer Weichel has actually joined the meeting, so she's
Okay.
participating as well.
Great. Well, Rebecca, I'll hand it back to you to go through the rule selection process.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so since we've shifted, and I noted this in the documents I sent out, we are looking at rules for the pilot study. Thank you to everyone who provided feedback. We really appreciate the time that you took to go through each one of the rules and kind of think about it in your mind. It takes a lot of energy, and so I appreciate that. So what we have now, what you guys received, there was one error in there. I do have to note that I have a header that I believe says seeps and springs twice, and the second one should actually be minimum option. And the document I'll be sending out tomorrow will have that corrected. But what we have now is a document that has both ODF staff and CMPC member comments. We want to view this as a working document. The document will evolve over time as new information and processes are developed. We will track by versioning the document because again, everybody's comments and feedback really helps inform the decision. So as you may have seen with the current version, the rules are kind of falling into, like I call them 3 categories or bins. Category 1, we have rules that are reasonable to measure, that a majority of folks felt like, okay, yes, this seems doable in the field. There are some that we still want to discuss. Then the second category is the rules that are better assessed by stewardship foresters during the pre-operation, active operation, and post-operation inspections. Now, stewardship foresters are out there in the field to help landowners avoid issues, help them identify issues when they arise, and if they do have issues occurred, they will issue corrective orders or a citation if needed. So the inspection process is very important, and we've identified rules where that is a place for the stewardship foresters. In addition to that, it would be hard to assess those particular rules a year and a half after the fact when we'd get back out there. And that was also noted by some of the committee members. Let's see. And then we also have rules that fall into the third category, which is rules that we don't have defined metrics yet. There are vague terms like, desired future condition, which I believe some metrics may be developed down the road, but also minimize. And so those I highlighted in yellow that we need additional conversations around those rules and how we, if those get selected down the road, how we want to measure them. Do we use and we don't have to answer this today, but like, do we use technical notes? Do we create some metrics? I know Washington Department of Natural Resources, they actually created some metrics for some of their rules. But again, those metrics weren't in rule, so it was kind of, they actually did it sort of, left it vague, like they have low, medium, and high compliance. So again, there's different ways we could consider going about it. So I now wanted to open it up for discussion in terms of what I have provided to you so far. And are there any rules that we are not considering currently that we haven't read that anyone wants to discuss? Or if there are any rules that are highlighted in yellow, this is time for you guys to provide input. But if you don't feel comfortable providing input in the meeting, you can send it to me by this Friday, if you guys have had a chance to look at it. So I'm just going to open it up for discussion. Did I lose you? Are you all there?
We're here.
Okay. You guys made me nervous there.
Yeah, Rebecca, do you want to just go through the ones that you have highlighted that need further discussion? Would that be more useful or?
We could do that. I don't, let me share that document. I'm going to share the West Side document.
Yeah, that sounds great, Amanda. I was like, I'm looking at the document and not at you right now, Rebecca.
Okay, let me see if I can pull that up real quick. And there was one comment about not, having someone from the east side, like a stewardship forester on the committee. And I will be going over these with Stacy Savona and with Tim Moss tomorrow. And Tim represents the east side. I'm trying to find if, okay, you guys see the east side one? Is that sharing?
Yeah, it's the east side.
Okay, I'm gonna stop share again. Let's see if I can get, I apologize for this. I have it open, but I'm gonna close the east side. See if I can get the west side open. There it is. They didn't like to share. Okay. Do you guys now see the west side rules?
Yeah, could you zoom in
Yes.
a little bit, Rebecca?
How's that?
Perfect.
Good.
Okay, let me scroll down. So just to start on this one, there were comments about not having the protocol for the channel migration zone. So for the pilot study, we would be looking at we wouldn't be hardcore on the channel migration zone. It would be just looking at the buffer widths. That's why I highlighted that, just so you know that it's, again, this is a learning process with the pilot study.
That makes sense to me, Rebecca. I just wanted to make sure that one of those was going to be assessed.
Yeah. Okay, here's the first one. Is there any particular one, Amanda, that you wanted to go to first, or should I just go through these?
No, I think it makes sense just to go through them.
Yeah.
On that first one, I will admit that I was the second member commenter. And so I guess, I don't know, do you guys have a response to the comment that I had around, a no to that question doesn't inform a non-compliance? And just how that would be looped in with some of the other rules and questions. And I think the next one that's actually highlighted, specifically talks about the allowable activities within the RMA.
Let me see here.
Right. So Amanda, you're saying on its own, this one doesn't really indicate compliance with anything because it's within a package, right? And the other questions are important. Is that what you're?
Yeah. And so like how the data is used and the statistics are used to report out on compliance, like this question can't be used alone.
Correct. And you see that we have 1 and 3A, and there's actually a few others that would kind of align with this question as well. Particular like with the standard option for small forest landowners. It's, are they, are the buffer widths, are they meeting those? Are we getting the 110-foot buffer? And Thomas, I believe you're here. I don't want to put you on the spot, but did you want to chime in at all? I may have put him on the spot.
What do you want me to chime in on?
About measuring this particular rule for compliance. It would be, are they, hold on, I've got one more person admitting. Are they, do we have the required buffer widths? So we would have a crew out there and they'd be measuring for that distance, either spot. I'm not quite sure how the study design would work, but are they, if they have a fish stream, do they have a 110-foot buffer on a large stream? Yes, no.
Yeah, it seems fairly straightforward to me as far as, standard practice. Just recognizing there may be other practices allowed in the rule if they have an approved, alternate plan or otherwise site-specific prescription. But yeah, that sounds reasonable.
And we would be looking at the notification, any written plans. So part of the whole compliance would be looking at as a package.
Yeah, so it'd be like if no, then did this happen? If no, then is this, and so that makes sense, but just thinking about how we organize the pilot to make sure that we get to the right answer on compliance, I think is important.
Agreed.
So just want to highlight that.
Thank you.
And I guess, yeah, within that, this second one, I guess, complicates the first one as well.
Yeah.
So
the one that we highlighted in red here.
yeah, that we said we're not going to measure, but we are going to measure 1. And so how do you measure 1 without recognizing 2? Because you are allowed to average. So you can't take a static point and say, well, no, it's not the right buffer width. But then if you actually average the entire length, which is what you're allowed to do, then it is. So how do you do 1 without 2? I guess.
Yeah, and this would be one of those scenarios of, it would take a lot more time, especially if we like contracted out a crew. So again, we need to work through these to figure out how we could do this in an efficient manner. I'm gonna go, sorry about scrolling. No, I hope I don't make anybody nauseous. Okay, can you guys see this one? We're now on 629-643-01005. Now this one, because it has other rules associated with it, there is, again, this is yellow, depending on how working with MHE, the study design is developed, if we're measuring all 3 rules at the same time, having a rule like this where there's the cross rule sections, it could be applied more easily than say if we're just doing riparian rules. So again, this one we wanted to have open for discussion even with MHE. It did have past civil penalty issues. So this one we had a mix from the committee members. We had some that said it was a high priority to measure it, others that noted how it might be complicated. Does anybody have any, especially the ones who provided input here that I've documented, does anyone want to chime in on this one?
This is Casey, Rebecca. I think that your like bringing the question to Mount Hood Environmental is a good thought. So I'd encourage that to make sure that they understand how they might assess it as it's in the study design.
exactly. Okay,
Yeah, and I'll just highlight, I have the very wordy response again on this one, as you can probably track with the comments that I made previously of kind of incorporating this into the logic, but it gets down to the efficiency of the, actual monitoring and the actual protocol and how do we incorporate it all. I think you can't measure one without including this, like I said previously. So I think it's important to include in the logic, as I've outlined in my anonymous comment.
yeah, sorry.
Um, but yeah, how we do that and how the design, is created, I think is going to be really important to make sure that we get at the right answer, which is what we all want, right? We all
Yeah.
want to know whether or not the stream buffers and that these new rules associated with riparian buffers are being complied with. And it's complicated because there's a lot of things that it's not just a straight, distance, pulled tape distance, horizontal distance from the stream. And it's the same distance the whole way. There's all these other things, right? And so I think that overall, this piece is really important. And, if we get nothing else right, other than getting kind of this logic and really looking at this specific question and the cadre of questions and rules associated with those buffers, I think we need to make sure that we get that right. And I think it's critical for us to be monitoring,
Yes.
as it relates to the intention and the goals of the HCP and this whole process, right?
Yes. And creating a study design that allows it to be done in an efficient manner, because if you have, you can imagine, if you have a population, you have a year to do it and you have 100 populations, that it could get very intense. But yes, finding a way to create that balance. Okay, I'm gonna go to the next one. So one of the things that we have, that we looked at kind of written plans, and in the past it was just presence absence of the written plan. We're kind of looking at that again just for efficiencies, because there would be a lot for us to like dive into the written plans and see how a stewardship forester viewed it. Yeah, it would be very intensive. So at this point, we're just looking at presence and absence. But I know that when it was required for a particular rule, but I know that folks were diving into, that it could get complicated, and it could, if we're actually looking at the details of the written plan without being on the site and trying to figure out what the stewardship forester and the landowner were thinking. And so again, this is presence absence would be fairly easy. We could get that information in ferns. It would be, yes or, do they have it? Do they not? So again, we can.
Yeah, Rebecca, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
I think it would be valuable to have the presence absence. And since Jennifer's on, she and I've talked so much for the HCP about these reporting, the value of reporting on things like PFAS and written plans. So having that and knowing kind of for which rule set would be valuable. And I recognize that diving into it and looking at the details is a totally different thing. That's not like a thumbs up, thumbs down number.
Yeah, exactly. And making sure, so that was another one that I had, we had kind of those prerequisite rules. And you guys are going to see this when we get into the road rules and the steep slope rules, but there are certain rules in a certain circumstance where it requires a written plan. And so just noting again, the presence absence, did they have that, did they submit a written plan? Because if they didn't submit the written plan and then they did the activity, then we have bigger issues, like they're already in non-compliance.
So
Okay.
I was just gonna say, Rebecca, you know, whether they had a written plan there or not, I mean, that's probably fine, and it's required that they have a written plan. My overarching concern is that this program not get too wrapped up in people's paper compliance. The issue really is about resources. And did they apply, you know, are the resources protected appropriately? And I mean, I don't disagree that we should, I would caution not getting to, from my perspective anyway, I don't think we want to get too wrapped around the axle about and too overly focused on paperwork processes and lose the on the ground outcome that we're trying to achieve. And I think that is the bread and butter of what this program should be about, is are the resources protected as they were supposed to be protected, and not necessarily so much about, you know, did every process happen to the perfect. I don't know. You get what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's not required and that you shouldn't look and that the department shouldn't have an opportunity to, you know, check on those things. That's all fine. It's all within your purview. I just would hope this program would stay more focused on the resource protection aspect.
I appreciate that. Yes. And luckily answering this question would be super easy because it's just a Fern search. So it wouldn't take that much time at all. So we're lucky on that end. But I do appreciate that focusing on the resources, and I agree that's important.
Rebecca, what would the follow-up to this be? So say there wasn't compliance, is that, I mean, is that seen as an issue with ODF looking at the notice and not following up, you know, stewardship forester not following up and indicating that a written plan is required and allowing the activity to occur? Is that solely the responsibility of the landowner? How would that be addressed?
So it's a very good question, because there's different routes we could take. One would be, if we come across this situation, we remove that notification from the population, right? So we say, okay, this does not meet the requirements, so we are not going to put this into the study. And then the question is that, do we notify the stewardship forester and say, hey, you know, we came across this, you know, and have them address it, or because, you know, or do we stay separate from that, you know, and just note that this is an issue, we need to have stewardship foresters look at it. So again, we need to develop a process. But from the get-go, I would see, okay, this, if say we came up with this notification, it didn't have a written plan, we at this point would remove it from the population for which we were going to do an audit. So what the next step is to be determined. We would want to figure that out, working with MHE and just internally, how do we want to handle that?
Make an observation. If you make it too complex at the on the ground compliance level, you're gonna cause, at least this is a small landowner perspective, you're gonna cause them to basically non-manage this thing, which for some people is good, but in a larger sense, and it may meet the requirements of the intent of the habitat conservation plan, but it can also create issues, safety issues and other issues in the not dealing with hazards in the woods. We just went through this process with the catastrophic events discussion. So it may be that both from a conservation enhancement perspective, but also from this catastrophic event, that we want to encourage people to do management in these zones. And this, making this more than a paper compliance, can become a problem. And I guess the conclusion is, it really comes back to all of those alternative plans. In my experience, the stewardship forester sees them on the ground, and that's where that on the ground compliance is, to say, yeah, they followed their plan. or not.
Yes, maybe being better assessed by a stewardship forester at that time, you know, working with the landowner.
Yes,
Yes,
assuming they're professional, trained people.
yes. Thank you. And again, I wanted to bring this, I was kind of talking about written plans in general, but I wanted to bring it back to this particular one. It had to do with pre-commercial thinning and releasing in a riparian management area.
Yeah, and just to like double down, I guess reaffirm that one. I think it's valuable to assess whether there was a written plan submitted
Presence
on
out.
especially on this particular one.
Any other comments? Okay, let's see. Again, I'm just going to the highlighted yellows. Apologize if, okay,
Yeah, I'll just chime in on that last one.
okay, yes,
Well, for what it's worth, I think that the more you have somebody jump through hoops for written plans for PCT seems really, well, I guess that's the interpretation of the rule. You're disincentivizing something that's actually really good to happen, or a really good thing. And if we don't have that happening, you're going to really stagnate stuff in that RMA. So I don't know. I'm just pointing out that to me, that's a level of ridiculousness that's unnecessary, but that ship's probably sailed, I guess. So I'm just speaking what my thoughts are.
thank you. And it is in rule, so we would want to make sure that, you know, stewardship foresters, when they're working with landowners and the landowner does want to do some pre-commercial thinning, that they make sure the landowner follows the process, just so that they don't end up getting a citation after the fact. So we do have to, but I understand, but again, this is what we've been given. So we want to follow through that with that. I do have, Casey, did you raise your hand?
I did, but I was just going to note the same thing you did, that it is rule. So our question is providing advice to you about which ones to assess for compliance monitoring purposes, not whether the rule is a good rule or not, right? Isn't that, I mean, I think that's why we're here, right? Or maybe I misunderstood what Seth was saying.
No, I mean, that's fine. I think maybe at this point we highlight, and if we find a bunch of non-compliance, maybe the discussion is this a rule that's worth anything? When we find non-compliance with this rule, are we actually finding harm happening from a PCT? And if not, then maybe this rule is, like I said, a step too far, and maybe that's the discussion that ensues. So I think it's
Yeah,
fine. I'm just pointing out that pre-commercial thinning in an area that has been artificially planted at a very dense rate is actually something everybody should want to have happen. There's absolutely no reason why a landowner does that other than ecological reason. There's no monetary benefit. In fact, it's a tremendous cost. You know, for small forest landowners, it's time that they're spending with their kids, grandkids, you know, themselves at a great cost to be down there in those areas doing that for the purpose of trying to get growth on the other trees instead of overly dense stocking of artificial reforestation. So I just I think I've said enough. I'll just stop.
I appreciate that input.
Yeah, Rebecca, there's another thing you said that I just want to highlight with Seth and some of Ken's comments earlier, and that was citations for written plans. And I would be really disappointed, particularly in the first year of the PFA, if ODF started issuing citations over something as minor as not submitting a written plan for a notification. I think that definitely disincentivizes small landowners in particular from actively managing their property.
Thank you, Megan. And as you know, how the stewardship foresters are out there working with landowners, they avoid having to do the citations. You know, they would do the corrective order or talk with the landowner and help them through that process. So again, that the citation is like the last resort. And again, that's out of the monitoring, compliance monitoring section that, you know, has to do with you know, the field support and the stewardship foresters. So that's not something that we would be dealing with at this point, or, you know, telling them whether to do citations or not. And that's the other thing when it comes to our approach, if we do come across it in the compliance monitoring, is, you know, informing stewardship foresters in a way that doesn't lead to a citation, you know, like go work with the landowner, you know, maybe they didn't know, that kind of thing. So we definitely, that's not what we're out there trying to do.
Just to wrap that, the written plan, if you're operating in these riparian zones, is already required. When you're operating within 300 feet of a riparian area, you have to do a written plan. This is just saying in that written plan, you also have to describe these activities that you're going to do in pre-commercial thinning. In my experience with the stewardship foresters, if I did this with a PCT, they're going to ask that question in that they would want that included in that written plan, because you have to describe how you're going to protect the resource anyways.
Thank you for that.
That's a standard riparian plan.
I'm going to move on to the next one. I do appreciate everybody's input on that. It was a good discussion. So now we have, and I don't feel like we're going to be able to get through all these by 11. So again, if there's, feel free to provide additional feedback by sending it to the monitoring email, the compliance monitoring email. So here we have for small type NP streams flowing into type SSBT. For locations upstream of the tree retention requirements in this rule, did the operator apply the RELZ or the ELZ as required? And again, it's referencing other rules. This one we had a mix. We had some members saying yes, monitor, and others, you know, noting, you know, what is minimized disturbance. Again, that's one of those ones we don't exactly have metrics for. It would be like, do you see it or do you not see disturbance? Let's see what, so those were the comments. And then again, this may be better assessed by stewardship foresters, because a year and a half after the fact, there's going to be a regrowth, you know, vegetation regrowth, that there may have been disturbance, but we now as the compliance monitoring surveyor can't see it. So again, this one, I wanted to have us discuss.
Yeah, Rebecca, I didn't comment on any of the NP stream stuff, as you probably
Yeah.
saw.
Yeah.
Because I didn't think it was appropriate at this time. And I would agree with some of the other commenters around, you know, I think this is much more appropriate for the stewardship forester to be looking at. You know, I did a field trip with the Society of American Foresters looking at people who've already started to utilize ELZs just to see for production purposes how much longer it takes, you know, trying to think about costs associated with doing business associated with the new rules. And we went out there, I think Thomas, you were out there with us, and it was like, can you tell? You know, can you tell what happened in this ELZ? And everybody was kind of like, well, it looks fine, but none of us know what it looked like before. So it's probably better. A lot of the stuff with the ELZ is probably going to be better associated with the stewardship forester at time of implementation, especially having that pre-operation knowledge of what the landscape looked like. So that, you know, just for what it's worth.
Thank you, Megan. Yes, that makes sense. Casey, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I was just realizing that I had a question, and then I realized, oh, you'll bring this to Mount Hood Environmental, and they'll probably help you with developing specific things that a field hand might actually measure. So that was just I was thinking about that and I realized I probably didn't need to ask you. I think that this is, and my comments to this were, this is an important thing to measure for compliance monitoring purposes. If we don't know this, we don't know a significant chunk of the upper end and actually extended protection, since we know that the ELZ extends along the whole thing. And so I think it's important to measure this, but I'm also happy to defer to Mount Hood Environmental about how to measure it.
And thank you, Casey. And as a reminder, because we will be, you know, the pilot study is going to be looking at all 3 rule sets. And we're going to be kind of trying to look at some of the key rules that are selected. It may be a while before we get to this one, again, because we have a year to pull something together and then a year to implement it. So these will be conversations, and like just what Megan noted about being out in the field, as we apply this rule, we're going to be learning, and we can then you know, we could hear from stewardship foresters of like, how are they doing it out in the field. So again, this is a working document in progress, and that we, as we get more informed, it will help us with this, you know, how to assess this rule. The other thing I wanted to note is that the field support folks are working on, you know, improving their inspections reports and how those get documented, and they're working on a policy. I don't know the exact details, but we will hopefully, you know, it sounds like what they're shooting for is to have more detailed notes from stewardship foresters when they're out during pre-operation, active, and post, so that we know that they're looking at these things and they are getting documented. But it may not be something that gets through the compliance monitoring program, but is during the inspection efforts. Now, Megan or Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong on that one, or if you have anything to add.
Yeah, I would just add one thing about stewardship forester to assess. I guess follow-up question there, just to make sure I'm tracking this. Does that mean to assess how this would be measured, or to assess in place of doing compliance monitoring work specifically on that rule?
They would be, are you asking me?
That's, I guess, whoever,
Yeah.
like, I don't know who put that comment in there. I guess we probably want to keep it anonymous, but I don't know if anyone can clarify what that means exactly.
I mean, I'll just highlight, you know, I think I would bucket that, Adam, with the other buckets that we have associated with appropriateness of monitoring in the field, you know, a year or more after the operation compared to monitoring at time of implementation as required by the stewardship forester in their job duties. So, you know, to me, it's not to say that it's not important. All of our rules are important, right? And so, but we're trying to talk about from a logical, reasonable perspective, what can and can't you assess, you know, a year or more following an operation. And I think as it relates to the ELZ and just my experience looking at these in the field, it's going to be much easier for a stewardship forester to assess the compliance of this rule compared to our ability through a compliance monitoring methodology a year or more following implementation.
Okay, thanks for that clarification, Amanda. Yeah, and I think that, you know, it might be a good point to acknowledge that stewardship foresters do a lot of great work out there in terms of enforcement and inspections. But they're, you know, the information we receive from them is limited on, you know, I guess, what's the right word I'm looking for? A statistical term of applying the results to a statewide level, because it is really kind of anecdotal. And so the studies that we do are specifically designed so we can just extrapolate, for lack of a better term, to the state level. And so there's some limitations on the information that you know, that we may receive from stewardship foresters. So just wanted to call that out for just in terms of the study, you know, versus field inspection.
Thank you, Adam. Yeah, and I should probably clarify that. The compliance monitoring unit wouldn't be looking at inspections, right? That would be something they reported out on and they could document what they were seeing. But the compliance monitoring unit would not be doing any sort of assessment of those inspections.
I think Josh's or Megan maybe had their hand up for a while.
Oh, sorry, I can't. Megan? Megan, did you have your hand up?
There are
This is
two
Josh. I've had my
Megans,
hand up
and
for a
I did
while.
not, thanks.
Oh,
Oh.
sorry. Megan, is that Megan Cogswell?
Yep, that was me. No hands, thanks.
Okay.
Josh
Hey,
does have
Rebecca,
his
this is
hand
Josh.
up.
I've had my hand up for a while.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I cannot see the hand raised. So, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing my comment reflected in here. So on the RELZs, and the ELZs for that matter, I had pretty much the same comment. So Megan makes a good point about why it might be preferable for stewardship foresters to do this work. And you know, one of the major points of the ELZ or RELZ, right, is preserve bank stability, prevent sediment introduction that can be damaging to the covered species and water quality generally. So that is going to be happening in the first year or two, if it happens at all. So, you know, Amanda makes a good argument for why a stewardship forester might be the appropriate way to do it. So my comment on that is whether it's a stewardship forester or like a compliance audit that is looking at these things, we have kind of a nebulous minimizing disturbance. That's not something you can repeatably measure. That is completely subjective, depending on which particular observer is looking at the ELZ or RELZ. One stewardship foresters or one field auditors disturbance was minimized is going to be a different person's there was too much here. That's not repeatable. So there needs to be, you know, if you did 2 observers for quality control looking at the same site, one after the other, you could get very different assessments. So for these kinds of questions, we need some kind of a standard for that's repeatable and measurable. What does minimizing disturbance mean? And I think these are really important things to measure, whether it's a stewardship forester or an auditor, but there has to be some kind of more objective you know, benchmark for disturbance was minimized. What does that look like? And then if we are having stewardship, if we are putting this on the stewardship foresters for this or some other ones, that data needs to be collected. And not just how do we measure minimized disturbance or excessive disturbance, but how the data is collected and cataloged needs to be standardized and repeatable, and it needs to be searchable. So if we're having stewardship foresters look at these RELZs, they need to be collecting the data in a consistent way, regardless of who the stewardship forester is. And then that needs to be going in some kind of a database that could then be searched for compliance. Okay, we had a satisfactory, unsatisfactory, or marginal ratings, for example. And then that's something that someone can go in and search and say, and actually see how our ELZ and ELZ compliance is going. The stewardship foresters looked at all these. Let's go search. We have 3 or 4 or 5 years of data. Let's see how our ELZ stuff is going. So we know if we need to focus more education and or enforcement here, and it's searchable, you can, you know, do an analysis of that data. So this one and similar ones, I'm fine with stewardship foresters doing it, but whoever's doing it, we need some kind of semi-objective or objective standard or categorization for minimizing disturbance and those kinds of more nebulous concepts. And the data needs to be collected in a standard way that's searchable, so that it can be compiled and analyzed at a later time.
Thank you, Josh. I do have to note, like, with when it comes to, we want to definitely distinguish between monitoring and inspections, right? The different programs, but when it comes to, if a stewardship forester did come across excessive disturbance, they would write them a corrective order, right? So they would say, okay, you have until this, you need to fix this by this point in time. And then the landowner would do that. So we don't have stewardship foresters going out collecting data in terms of, for data sake, you know, they are out there to make sure that the resources get protected. And if there is an issue, that they get that issue corrected. So we want to make sure we don't start putting data collection on stewardship foresters. I mean, yes, they document their inspections and that's great. But again, with so many different stewardship foresters, I don't think we want to go down that route of data collection. And we can have more conversations about this, but the idea of, if they, I do agree that it would be good to have a standardized way to measure minimize. But again, sites are very different, and they may be different standards for different areas given site specific characteristics. So again, there's a lot of nuances there, but I do want to be careful going down the route of data collection for stewardship foresters, which is more of a monitoring unit thing, where in terms of data collection. And Thomas or Adam, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, I agree with that, Rebecca. The role of the stewardship forester isn't to implement a statewide compliance monitoring program or to necessarily engage with that. They've got a different role here in terms of inspections and enforcement and implementing the FPA rules. So thanks for calling that out, Rebecca.
Yeah, I raised my hand, but Stephen raised this right after me. And I've talked a lot, Stephen. I'm lowering mine.
Okay. All right, thanks. Yeah, the minimize, I mean, I think there might be some general ways to define it. But I think what's important is what would minor disturbance versus major disturbance look like? So a visual. And then not just for the stewardship foresters, but for the landowners when you're doing training. So sometimes probably like a note that would go along with training that describes, here are what we mean by minimum to moderate disturbance versus heavy disturbance and maybe detrimental disturbance. And so those would be visuals, so that you know, as you mentioned, it can be subjective. What somebody thinks is major disturbance, another person might think, oh, yeah, maybe it's moderate disturbance. So giving people a visual, what is acceptable and not. And I realize it varies across the state and soils and things like that, but there's some definite visuals that can be used to say, this is not good. So I think coming up with a general definition of what minimize means, and then coming up with a note that describes or shows visually what that means. Thanks.
Thank you. And I now see that there's three, or is it Steve or Amanda? I'm not sure. Or was it Casey? Who's
Well,
next?
Steve here.
No, Steve and then Amanda.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want to tag on to what Steve Fitzgerald just said. I think a lot of this gets down to, you know, this is new to everybody, and I think getting information and some visuals out there are critical. But I totally agree that, you know, you can't really monitor this formally without defining clearly to everybody and to everybody's understanding what constitutes compliance if we're going to monitor for it. And also thank you for differentiating the role of the stewardship forester, that they're not going to be doing any formal monitoring. That's for the monitoring unit to do. So thanks for clarifying that.
Thank you, Steve. Amanda?
Yeah, and I just wanted to highlight that we do have technical guidance on the ELZ rules. So there is, for those that haven't read that, there is more specification as far as how those rules are to be applied on the ground and what is and is not allowable disturbance. So maybe we need to review that, or that needs to be sent out for further understanding. But I guess at the end of the day, you know, the comments that I made originally still stand, in that the operations I've seen to date, you know, through voluntary mechanisms prior to implementation of the rule set, indicate that this would be very challenging to assess through this formal compliance monitoring program.
Thank you, Amanda. Ken?
And I would just say to that point and to what Steve has said, both Steves, and is something that Josh said, which is it probably need to define what way this protects what way this rule protects the resource. So is it, as Josh said, the introduction of sediment, particularly in the the wet season, so to speak, by removing or disturbing the soil so much that it is allowed to move through that at that point. It helps to kind of define later how you assess this as well. Those metrics that kind of guide the technical guidance for the stewardship forester.
Thank you, Ken. Are there any other hands raised that I'm not seeing?
No, Rebecca, I was just gonna add, sorry, don't worry, it's not gonna extend it. I was scrolling through all the yellows. There's a lot of yellows.
Yes.
And so just bearing in mind the time too, I want to make sure that if there are ones that people are like, whoa, I really need to share.
Thank you, Casey. Yes. Is there, but I appreciate that, Casey, but also I'm thinking about it, a lot of these same things that are coming up in this conversation, I think we're going to see, it's kind of a repeated issues that, one, defining these and then distinguishing between what the monitoring unit does and then what the field support folks do, or that, the stewardship foresters. And also to note that when a stewardship forester sees disturbance, most likely, depending on the level and the resources near there, they're going to be in the mode of like, okay, yeah, this is an issue because of this, a fish stream or and the drainage issues, that they're going to do a corrective order and get it fixed. And that's what we want. We don't want to be like, well, we want to document that they did something. We want to make sure that it gets corrected. And so there is that process and recognizing those two efforts that are taking place. Josh?
So then, given the clarifications about the role of the stewardship forester from you and Adam, if we're relying on stewardship foresters to assess this and similar rules, how are we able to use that to determine compliance? And you don't have to have an answer for it right now, but that's my question. If that's the way to go, is to that, stewardship foresters are evaluating this rule and similar rules in the moment, or just post operation. And if there's a need for corrective action, is that something where we can then go later look and say, out of, X number of RELZs or X, number of units with RELZs on the landscape, Y number had corrective action? I mean, how do we use that to, I get the difference between monitoring and field support, but how do we use that stewardship forester action or lack of action if someone did a good job to assess compliance? Because these, from a water quality and species perspective, these are very important rules. and having some idea of their compliance is really important. So, you know, given that, and it does seem to me like it's probably most appropriate, both like in terms of the physics and the ecological function, and also like efficiency of effort, to have stewardship foresters look at it. How do we use that to determine some kind of estimate of compliance so we know where we need program improvement?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind is that that I'm reluctant to use that information to report out on compliance. But particularly in our studies, as I mentioned before, and I mean, big reason is not randomized, right? So, you know, that could potentially introduce some bias there. And a big sort of, I guess, strength of our studies is that we intentionally set up a study design so that it can be evaluated at the statewide level, and there's randomization involved. So that's a really key piece to distinguishing a study that can be you know, considered these are the strengths and weaknesses of, or areas that need improvement across the state versus some, you know, reporting out from stewardship foresters. So it would be missing that randomization aspect, which would be, I think there'd be a lot of risk there in terms of reporting that out. Hopefully that helps answer your question, Josh, but that's sort of my initial thought there.
Yeah. Thanks, Adam. Yeah, and we don't need to resolve this right now. I just want to say that leaves us in the situation of being unable to confirm compliance rates on this part of the stream network, and you know, in a controlled, statistically valid fashion. And so that's a concern for me, and I'll just leave it there.
I do want to though note again, Josh, that the they are working on ways to improve the inspection documentation. And as you know, and again, this is outside of compliance monitoring, but the TMDL effort will be tracking number of inspections. So there is a whole other route that is outside of the statistical statewide compliance monitoring. So I just wanted to put that note in there. So there are other ways that we will be looking at that. Any other hands raised? Anything in chat that I'm missing that we should?
No, I just put a note in there about the tech guidance for our ELZs and ELZs, and Thomas has responded to it too.
Okay. Are there, and like Casey had noted, are there any particular rules that that anyone feels strongly about that we should jump to? Again, here we again have the RELZ and ELZ. But feel free to chime in if there's a particular rule you want to look at. So looking at the comments on this one, again, it's related to kind of stewardship foresters rule, being able to address it site specific at the time versus after the fact. And again, there's that word minimize. So again, that kind of falls in like, we definitely want to look at these and have additional discussions. Again, written plans. Again, we're looking at just presence, absence. So you can see there's a ELCs are one that they're new, and we're going to be trying to figure these out. I do also see like, as, Amanda noted that she was out in the field, we are going to be learning a lot over the next few years as these new rules get implemented. That will help us inform our process.
So Rebecca, in
Yes,
regards to this, the operational field survey, if you haven't looked at that protocol, for doing that, especially for operators doing that, or small landowners, that you have to, there's two levels. So if you have a high fidelity, or what they call a high resolution, survey, it actually is entered into the database through a review process by ODF and ODF and W. So those points will be, that database will be adjusted to those points. It's the low resolution survey that is approved at the one-time use level and not permanently changing the database. So that's those points, though, that documentation, that survey actually, I don't know how that's maintained, that at ODF. But that's part of the approval process for an operator to gain a one-time adjustment of the modeled stream. Those points, and it's required that you show those 3 points in both the high resolution and low resolution surveys.
thank you, Ken.
Rebecca, I'll jump in on that one just to provide some clarity. So Ken's right, those we defined in the protocol like high resolution versus other or low resolution, but really that comes down to high resolution being as long as that geospatial file is submitted with the survey, we consider it high resolution, and if it does include that, it will be incorporated into the statewide flow line data for future use and for memorializing it as well. There are discussions around including, and we do keep those records of those that are not submitted with the high res data or the geospatial data. We have those separated out, and we do keep them on our server. But again, they're not in the database. But there are discussions about we are adjusting the protocol 1 to kind of fix some collection issues that come up in the first season. So ODFW in-stream specialist is working on that. And I think that should be coming out here, I think, before too long in the spring. So everybody has that revised protocol in hand. But that is one of the issues that came up is, just because we don't have, or somebody doesn't submit that geospatial file, is there a reason we couldn't incorporate the information into the flow line data, which is the statewide hydrography regulatory network? So that is likely to be adjusted. So those discussions are still occurring.
When we revisit these rules for the long-term study, we'll have more information at that time and we can make decisions at that time of whether we include it or not, or how to include it if we do. I think this kind of falls under the last one. Again, we're working through the newness of these rules and how we're going to incorporate them. And Hey, this one, I want to bring up, the seeps and springs. We received a lot of comments on this one. And and Thomas, correct me if I'm wrong, we don't actually have, like data or field maps that show where seeps and springs are, like we have wetland maps in ferns that show like potential wetlands. This one would be very difficult to assess, especially given that the seeps and springs can be present. You may see them in the winter months, but not in the summer months. So there's a lot of nuances to this that really require on-site stewardship forester seeing and addressing at that time. It would be difficult to, again, we don't want them out there GPSing seeps and springs just because that's not their job. So again, this is one that I think we would want to have further discussions about in terms of, because I know there was some comments about creating a database and tracking these, because they are very important. But what my mind right now is thinking, as these get implemented, it's just important to protect them and to make sure that the stewardship foresters are helping the landowners protect them when they're laying out their work, their operation. Are there any hand raises that I'm not seeing? Did I lose you guys? Are you still there?
No, I'm still here. Yeah, I think for this one, it's just kind of gets back similar to the question I had before on the written plans of like, okay, what does this come down to? Sort of what is the ramification, I guess, or what data do we have? I think I commented around that, like what data do we have to identify these, and what would the protocol be for folks that are actually out there doing the monitoring, the compliance monitoring? Are you going off of a layer that was updated or is new? Are you going off of what was included in the NOAP? Like what that would look like, right? Because if you guys are finding additional seeps and springs that were unknown, how can you, I guess, hold somebody accountable to that if they didn't have access to that knowledge?
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, this would be a difficult one at this point in time to measure during a compliance audit, because we do not have, maps that are showing where it is. And that would then propose an issue when we're pulling a population. If we wanted to look at seeps and springs, there's no way for us to query in ferns which sites have seeps and springs to address this particular rule. Definitely, I think I'm the one that said maybe better assessed for stewardship forester. So it would be, if there is a way that down the road that we have maps that get developed, but that's a bigger question. And
Yeah, this is Josh. I don't think there's a way to rely, based on my experience with both GIS and hiking around a lot of stream bottoms and squishy areas. Like, there's not a way to actually have a map layer to rely on. This is, I think, if it is documented, this is where we're relying on like the landowner and their forester to be able to identify these features, because there's not going to be a map out there and they can move around on the landscape. I could go and map an entire area really thoroughly in 2012, and by 2024 those seeps and springs might have moved around. Water flow patterns underground shift. And so I don't think relying on any kind of GIS would be part of this. I think it's going to rely on, did the landowner or their representative, their forester, spot this stuff? And then if we did audit it, it would have to be, does the ground, whoever's doing the auditing on the ground, do they know how to identify these features by soil characteristics, by plants that are present, or, obviously by water movement itself, by spotting the water itself. But, you know, like when I've been out in the field with company foresters, if you know, the experienced ones will point out some coltsfoot and say, oh, here's a seep right here. There's no water, but you know, they're looking at the plants and spotting the wet soil, and you would have to have auditors who had that level of skill and experience in order to audit this one. It'd have to be field-based. You really can't do it with GIS layers. And so for that reason, I agree, it's very complicated. You have to have a high level of skill and soil and plant knowledge to be able to be an auditor for this sort of thing. So this might be one for later, even though some, you know, I think it's extremely important as this CMPC member comment here. You know, given the importance of these water features to amphibians and water quality. I don't think that was me. I don't think I'm praising myself. But anyway, maybe it was, I just don't remember, but I agree with that sentiment. This is really important, but I think this one might be really hard to do kind of in our first run through, and maybe something to think about for a future round of compliance monitoring.
Thank you, Josh. Thomas, did you have your hand raised?
Yeah, just add make sure the intent of the rule or this rule is around, you know, if it is identified, which is the kind of, I think, the discussion, how to identify them. And that's subjective and it could change. And if they are, you know, if they're within a certain distance of the edge of the RMA is where the change in the RMA would be implemented on the ground. So that, just think about, you know, that's the rule, is to increase the RMA where they are, you know, near the edge of the outside edge of the RMA. So just keep that in mind, what the intent of the rule is.
Thank you, Thomas. I think with this rule here, it kind of goes back to what Josh C just noted about identifying wetland areas. It would take someone who had that expertise. So again, probably not a fit right now for the pilot study, but definitely still under consideration down the road as we implement. Does anyone have any comments on this particular one? I know we still need to work on getting guidance out around the channel migration zone. Thomas, do we have a timeline around that one?
Yeah, it's on my what did Casey mention earlier, the to-do list.
Yes.
I think it's ready. You just got to get it reviewed, you know. And I think, you know, this was referenced in, just to kind of give you a preview, I guess, for anybody who's curious, is that the CMZ definition was pretty much carried over from what Washington used, so there'd be a lot of similarities there. And just to think about, CMZs are really only present in a larger stream system with a lot of hydrologic power, so most likely going to occur in a small subset of the streams in the state.
Thank you, Thomas. Another one that we would want to discuss and figure out if it could be included in, kind of like Amanda had noted, when you're packaging these different rule sets for compliance, because they're all kind of related, is this one that we could put in there?
Rebecca, I've got a question, and maybe Ken and Rick can add. Since there are specific rule sets for small forest landowners that differ from large industrial, would this be a separate subset? And like, how do you think, how are you guys thinking about statistical significance in populations as it relates to the small forest land stuff? And I don't know, I've got a lot of questions about that.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, so this is a conversation we will be having with MHE, and we kind of have started that conversation in terms of how do we create the study design, because we have these specific rules that are just for small forest landowners. So, we'd want to look at them differently. And again, if you think about it, we're basing these off completed notifications. So like, having enough, a greater population to be statistically significant. So these are all things that we need to be considering when we create the study design. Which, when MHE does propose concepts, we will be bringing it to the committee for input. Okay, let's see. Then, so these are specific to small forest landowners. I do have to note that some of these are in yellow just because they are new and we're working through them, and we want to get field input and landowner input. Ken, you have your hand raised?
Yes, so these rules do have a cap, the 5% cap on the watersheds. So there's I don't know, in determining compliance for an HCP, there is this cap, but there are exceptions to the cap once you have certain other conditions, such as the disproportionately impacted landowner or the catastrophic event if they adopt these rules. So there are these kind of things that are kind of coming into play. I don't know. I think I kind of agree with the comment that says in this first year, when we're determining which of these watersheds will reach that cap first, there are some. I think that watersheds might go in cycles because of the ages of the stands in those watersheds, in a broad sense, at the that fifth level watershed. There's some that may be in younger ages initially, and that over time they'll grow into merchantable timber. But I don't know. This is a real nebula. I'm not keeper of the data, so I don't have visibility on that kind of stuff. But general impressions is right now, it's pretty tough. And you might think if log markets were really strong right now, that there would be a lot of harvesting and we'd reach these 5% caps very quickly. But right now, I think Amanda will tell you, loggers are struggling to find work because log prices are down. Our economy isn't that strong at the moment. So I don't know if it's going to result in us reaching or longer time span for when these watersheds hit that 5% rule.
Thank you, Ken. And you just highlighted the complexity with the small forest landowner rules. And creating a statistically sound study, that there are a lot of nuances that we're gonna have to figure out. Particularly like what you said, like what you said with the population of completed notifications. And the ebbs and flows of that. Amanda?
Yeah, I mean, going way back to the beginning of our conversation, thinking about that very first rule and the intent or goal of assessing whether or not we are achieving compliance on stream buffers, right? On the new stream buffers, like this is specifically talking about type N streams, the ones that we have up here. But, as it relates to the other rules that we were reviewing associated with, fish and SSBT streams in particular, and thinking about the minimum option and things like that for small forest landowners. I mean, are you guys thinking about similarly to the like, if no, but this, but that, and additional logic questions? Would you be thinking about including small forest landowners within that general population of the model of the methodology, and that those are just those additional logic steps that apply to that specific sub population within the general kind of N of the population of the study?
We definitely we'll be considering the complexity. Yes. As you noted, there's lots of nuances. So how we go about that is we want to work with MHE to figure out how do we do this so it makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Adam,
Yeah.
do you have anything to add to that, Adam?
No, I mean, you bring up a good point, and how to handle that, if it's a logic-based approach. We're still figuring that out, Amanda, but open to any thoughts you have there, on how to handle that.
Since this is almost watershed level monitoring statewide, because one watershed might be under these constraints and not, and these others are not. So we can't consolidate too high, because then we'll get this kind of false narrative about success and failure, because it is different from each watershed.
Thank you, Ken. Yes. These are all really good points that we need to take into consideration. So Ken, I kind of have to go back to what Amanda and Ken just said. The small forest landowner rule sets, we need to figure out. We need to figure out how to measure compliance with those. East side, west side, how are we going to create a study design that captures these nuances? And again, if you have input or ideas, feel free to send them to the monitoring unit email. Let's see. These are. We had one person that said, do not monitor. Again, it would be complex to identify these scenarios. So when I'm thinking about creating the population set of completed notifications and finding these scenarios where you can measure compliance, I could see as being difficult. Potentially, if they came across it and they had a data sheet that they could fill out, if they came across it, that is something that Washington State compliance folks do. So again, trying to figure out how we would approach that. Anyone have any comments about the type D streams, the streams with drinking water sources? Think then, yeah, then we just go into kind of those prerequisite rules, which I kind of talked about at the beginning. They're really just presence, absence, kind of part of the weeding out process of whether they're included in the study or not.
Hey, Rebecca, I've got a quick question. You were asking about the type D
Yes.
streams. In the past, as it relates to compliance monitoring, we've been really focused within kind of what rule set or goal or objective we're trying to assess. For instance, on the reforestation rules, that's, you know, really the only one that I have been a part of since I've been here at AOL. I guess I'd like to make sure that we are not overreaching and being focused enough in what we're trying to assess so that we can be detailed enough to get the results we're looking for. And so the more we add in, you know, I mean, thinking about, we've got a pretty good grasp on the type F and type SSBT stream stuff, right? Then we add N, you know, type N, NP, NS. Then we add in ELZ stuff. Then we add in type D streams. Then we add in the seeps and springs. At what point are we trying to capture too much? And where do we draw the line on where one study ends and another study begins?
Excellent comment.
Yeah, I can address that, Rebecca, and feel free to chime in. That's a something that it's always in the back of my mind is do we have too much here? And what can be monitored successfully, right? And so this, you know, initial rule selection, I think we've identified roles that are very apparent that we want to monitor. And today we're going through the ones that are kind of questionable, a lot of gray area. And then there's some that, you know, I think there's a category that that just wouldn't make sense to monitor because it's too vague or for whatever reason. But I see it as an iterative process. So we're going to bring a set of rules to MHE. And Rebecca will talk more about that moving forward. And I think the pilot study will really help, you know, determine whether we are overreaching, because, you know, there's the other piece to this is the logistics, resources, time, and money to implement this, right? And so that's I think where the pilot study will really help to, I think, get at your question about overreaching.
Yeah, and I think I just, you know, when I look at research and I'm looking at research, you know, scientific papers and things, they tend to be relatively focused to try to ensure that we are reducing the number of external factors, right? And not drawing correlation, but causation, right? Because that's really what we're, you know, in a sense, yes, there's a lot of things that are correlated, but we're really wanting to try to get down to that causation. We really want to try to get at how do we address these issues. And so just thinking about that, I personally feel like we're biting off more than we can chew, which is why I did not provide substantive comments on a lot of the NP stuff at this time. And I think I provided some comments similar on the small forest land stuff where, especially on the statistical significance side and the population side, and, you know, how specific do we want to get, thinking about what affects everyone in a more or most similar way first is probably going to be a good, in my mind, a good place to start. And then moving from there, not to say we can't have robust conversation and discussion about how we address that next step, etc. But yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to think about how that all works and the budgetary and kind of personnel time associated with one thing versus trying to do too much at first in order to try to get ahead, which I appreciate, but just trying to think strategically about that.
Yeah, I appreciate the question.
So has there,
Francis had a question in the chat.
Let's see.
I'm new to this, so I'm just listening a lot, and you all know way more about this than I do.
Thomas, do you want to answer that, or are you still here? I don't know if he's still here. The question.
So I don't think I was got Teams messages rolling in on other stuff. What's the question?
Would type D streams be covered under other regulations through DEQ and OHA?
For forest practices, we specifically protect the vegetation around type D streams that are not otherwise protected under the RMA prescriptions. So if there's no other fish protections or NP protections, then the type Ds are protected for RMA vegetation when they're identified and outside those areas.
Thank you, Thomas. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint and talk about next steps.
so Rebecca,
Yes.
I guess add on to answering Francis's question there is a difference between public water and private water. Private water doesn't fall under the purview of DEQ or any of those. So water quality, those type of questions. So public water and private water are different. But then back to this question about the NP stream and the discussion of taking on too much. Has the HCP writers identified like prioritization of critical elements of the HCP that need to be monitored, have greater priority for initial monitoring? That would maybe help inform a discussion about risk analysis in the monitoring program.
Adam or Thomas, do you want to respond to that, or?
I'm sorry, your mic wasn't working there, Rebecca.
Oh, Adam, are you able to respond to that, or Thomas?
Yeah, in terms of the HCP prioritizing roles to monitor, definitely coordinating with Jennifer a lot, and keeping her up to date on this. And that's something still ongoing conversation, where, we have, but appreciate the suggestion there on that, Ken.
I'm going to kind of, so the rules that were remaining were the prerequisite rules. So I switched to this. So the prerequisite rules, again, will just help potentially, again, after discussions with MHE, how we define the population. So in terms of the pilot study next steps, I'll be listening to this recording and providing, additional feedback into the comments of this document. I will be meeting with the field coordinators, Stacy Savona and Tim Moss, tomorrow, and kind of go over the rules that we are considering to include. Have that discussion. We will then be taking the rules selected. Again, not all of them will be incorporated, but the rules that we'll be then presenting to MHE for consideration for the pilot study. Then we will be repeating this effort with roads and steep slope rules. So I'll be sending out a similar document, but with all the roads and steep slope rules, and we'll again kind of go through this weeding through process of how, what cream do we want to have rise to the top to include in the pilot study? So a lot more discussions and reviewing of rules will be coming up. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Rebecca just added a little more context on the type D.
Oh, yes.
And if there's specific questions about how we identify those, you can send my email out or contact info if you want to. Francis has further questions on that.
Thank you.
Hey, Rebecca,
Yes.
before we all sign out here, at what point will we be able to have something more firmed up to review? And will we be coordinating or communicating or getting any sort of, presentation from Mount Hood Environmental? Can you expand a little bit on that last slide? And
Yes. So we will be presenting these rules to MHE, having conversations with them regarding the pilot study and kind of study design and field protocol. Also the kind of that conversation of what can we bite off, like what is too much. We do plan to have MHE provide updates to the Compliance Monitoring Committee. And then they will be providing drafts of their technical documents for the committee to provide input. And then there'll be final documents. So it will definitely be iterative, and we will be having the committee involved. So in terms of timeline, that's still to be determined, but in the next, either in April or in July, MHE will be talking to the committee, presenting to the committee. Does that answer your question?
yeah, I think that's helpful.
Okay. And they'll be doing the same thing for the roads and steep slope rules that we are doing for the riparian rules. I do want to thank everyone for their input today. It was extremely helpful.
Yeah, and just one thing to add to the timeline, the next committee meeting, we can provide a more detailed timeline of the work order contract, or that will be laid out in the work order contract with MHE. So you get a better feel for specifically what the work is relative to the committee meetings and when MHE will be presenting. And we can send that out in advance once we get that firmed up in our work order contract with MHE.
Yeah, that'd be helpful, Adam, like any sort of scope of work or anything that would be included in that.
Sure. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. I think that concludes our meeting. Appreciate all the feedback and discussion on the riparian rule selection, and I hope everyone has a great week.
Thank you.
See
Bye,
ya.
guys.
Thanks, everyone.